Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Sorry, just trying to get the lighting right. Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from Israel. Tomorrow has already been called a day of grief by Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's going to be an emotionally devastating day. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, it has just been released in the last few hours that Israel is to receive 4 bodies, hostages who were taken alive on October 7th, but are no longer alive. And as part of the agreement, in the first phase, they will be returned to Israel. It is now known they are Shiri Bibas and her 2 children, Ariel Kfir and Oded Lifshitz. And obviously anyone who's been following the whole situation since October 7th will be very, very familiar with Shiri and her 2 children, the ginger-haired, very prominently displayed children who were kidnapped on that day. The father was released recently, about 20 days ago. Most of Israel assumed that they were no longer with us for many, many months. Hamas told the father while he was still in captivity and filmed them telling him that they'd been killed. Hamas claimed that they'd been killed in an Israeli attack. That's what Hamas pretty much are still standing by. Perhaps tomorrow or the next few days we'll have some more answers. But tomorrow will be a very sad day to see these coffins, however they're going to be returned. There's going to be a very solemn handover. It's not going to be the sort of cheer, the happiness, obviously, of the live hostages. I'm assuming that Hamas isn't going to do a whole show that they've done before. The Red Cross has asked for a tasteful handover. They're going to receive the bodies, and then they're going to hand them over to the Israeli army. There's going to be a brief and very sort of state ceremony with a rabbi and the IDF, and the coffins will be draped in Israeli flags, and then they'll be brought to Abu Kabir Forensic Institute, which is the place where really has been overworked, sadly, over the last 16 months, where bodies go to be identified, and not just identified, but also the cause of death will be investigated. And obviously, again, not to go into too many details, a lot will depend on the situation of the bodies themselves, but we should have some idea. First of all, they have to be officially identified. That's part of the process, and it can take up to a few hours, because it's not just looking at them and getting an idea of what they look like. You have to do DNA swabs and all the rest of it. And sadly, I know from experience, a family member of mine who fell on October 7th, that it can actually take a few hours, even if you are almost 100% certain that this is, or even 100% certain. They have to go through all these steps. This is part of the sort of bureaucracy. So we may not get absolute definitive answers, although, as I said, these are the names that have been released. There is actually, I saw just now, some outrage and anger from the Bibas family against the Prime Minister's office, that they've already come out and said definitively these are the bodies, even though they said that they haven't heard anything themselves. They haven't been officially notified. And for months, they've been asking for some sort of clarification. And the first clarification they get is to jump the gun before official confirmation. One can understand the anger and the outrage. from the family that really hoped against hope for so many months that their loved ones will be returned somehow. On a better note, we'll see on Saturday the last 6 living hostages of phase 1. And that will pretty much conclude phase 1. All the living and all the dead will be, actually, no, sorry, I should take that back. There's another 4 bodies to be returned next week, but they'll probably be returned in the middle of the week. And that will be the end of phase 1. And the whole big question is what's going to come after that, because obviously we've been used to the last few weeks, every single Saturday, sometimes even other days, hostages have been released. There's been the whole sort of tension leading up, the joy of seeing them alive, the devastation of seeing the situation sometimes. But it's been that roller coaster that Israelis have been on for the last few weeks. So it's going to feel very strange if there isn't another group of hostages released on the Saturday after. So there'll start being a certain amount of pressure to continue. It's unclear as of yet if phase 2 negotiations have started or not. But what we have seen is really ahead of tomorrow, which will be such a difficult day, probably one of the most difficult days since October 7th. It's really the only thing that Israelis are talking about. Everyone is girding themselves tomorrow for what is going to be a very emotional day. So it was really disheartening to see the politicking in the background over the negotiations taking place. What we did see is, in recent months, we saw attacks on former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant that led to his removal from office. Then we saw IDF Chief of Staff Herzliya Halevi. He was the next one in line. There were leaks against him. There was all this discontent, blaming him, etc., etc. Not to say that he didn't deserve as the Chief of Staff and the Defense Minister on October 7th. But we saw a very similar mechanics to this. We saw suddenly some blame being thrown their way from the same sort of direction until it led to their removal. We saw that with Gallant, we saw that with Halevi. What we're now seeing is almost identical with the Shin Bet, the Israel Internal Intelligence Security, Shin Bet. The head of it is Ronen Bar. Now, Ronen Bar, along with his counterpart in the Mossad, David Barnea, have been basically leading negotiations since they began all these months. They have now Ronen Bar specifically. It's a debate still whether David Barnea is being accused or not, but at the moment, all aim seems to be very specifically on Ronen Bar, that he failed in the negotiations, and he's going to be replaced by Strategic Affairs Minister and very close confidant to the Prime Minister Netanyahu, Ron Dermer. Ron Dermer, this is an open secret that Bibi wanted Ron Dermer to lead negotiations for a while, but haven't found the right moment. The fact that they're doing this the day before the Bibas family appear to be returning in coffins has left a very bad taste in the mouth. It was also very awkwardly done. As we've seen so many times over the last few months, or even the last few years, we get this sort of press statement by an anonymous senior political or diplomatic figure, which everybody knows it's an open secret. It comes from Netanyahu or his office. And they basically blamed Ronen Bar that the negotiations didn't work out so well. It was more, in Hebrew, it works better. Hebrew, the language, the translation of negotiations is give or take Masar Matan. And this anonymous source basically said there's been too much give and give rather than give and take. Interestingly and ironically, this is exactly the same source that then lauded the negotiations and said that Prime Minister Netanyahu takes credit for the fact that things have moved up. The fact that on Saturday, 6 alive hostages will be released. So it's kind of ironic that they're saying the negotiations worked, on the other hand, saying that the person who led the negotiations failed. But it's clear that a decision was made after Gallant, after Halevi. The next one in line to fall is Ronen Bar. Now, again, that's not to say that they don't deserve this as the people in their positions on October 7th, but there's been a clear strategic decision to go after them one by one. And we'll see where it lands. The interesting thing about the anonymous source that everybody knows comes to the Prime Minister's office is almost exactly the same statement came out a few hours later, specifically from the Prime Minister's office. So there wasn't even really, in the end, there wasn't even a pretense that it was, some sort of anonymous source. And one wonders why these things are still taking place. The further irony of this all is that the reporters who basically kind of let it out that these things happen and it pretty much Bibi is the source, were then removed from an official WhatsApp group with the spokespeople of the Prime Minister's office because they didn't play by the rules of the game. And in fact, the Prime Minister's office statement came out and said that's why they were removed, because they didn't play by the rules of the game. All of this, again, on a day where, just the whole country is girding itself, is really, as I said, left a bad taste in the mouth of many. But this is where we seem to be today. The question is, what's going to happen now? Hamas reportedly have come out and said that they're interested in speeding up the second phase, that they are quite happy to release all hostages. It's not sure if the living and the dead, but it seems probably on one day. And that day would also mean that not only would Israel release the requisite number of prisoners, convicted criminals, terrorists, convicted murderers, I should say, but also that would be the end of the war. It's Hamas's interest to get everything over in once. They don't believe that Netanyahu will, and the Israeli government will see to the end. They think that Israel will not allow the end of the sort of negotiations and all the different phases, because that would mean Hamas would remain in power and Israel would have to remove itself completely from the Gaza Strip. That's going to be obviously problematic from many points of view, but it would mean that Bezalel Smotrich has no more excuses to remain in the government, and he would have to leave. And he would leave before the budget. Again, we keep on going back to this, but it's all part of the wider picture. The budget, which is supposed to be passed by the end of next month, the end of March, would then fail, and we would be going to elections. So it's in Netanyahu's interest to sort of elongate this as much as possible. Hamas want to make it as quick as possible. What I suggested last week or the week before, I believe still may well be on the cards, because Netanyahu trying to find a way to ensure the negotiations or the releases continue to happen without officially going to phase two. Let's not forget at this point that President Trump and his Middle East envoy, Witkoff, have gone on record and says that they expect phase two to happen. They expect all the hostages to be released, and they want the end of the war for now. So Netanyahu really has to thread that the eye of the needle, and probably what he'll do is he won't officially go to phase two, but there'll be a sort of phase 1A, a continuation of phase one, just with sort of agreements week by week, what's going to be the number of releases, etc., etc. Now, that's obviously not what Hamas wants, so it might be a difficult one to do. Netanyahu knows he's still got the Trump threat over Hamas, but there's only going to be a certain amount that they can do it. If Netanyahu could stretch it out to the end of March, perhaps he gets to keep his government through that crucial date. But it's going to be a very difficult undertaking. And the assumption is, or the assumption that I would make is, that's why he wants his closest confidant, Ron Dermer, leading negotiations so he can control them as much as possible. Because although, let's not forget, Ronen Bar, David Barnea, his appointees, at the end of the day, he doesn't control them as much. Ron Dermer is very much Bibi's man, and while he will be leading negotiations, Netanyahu will have an extremely close hand on things. He'll be able to dictate the pace of negotiations if he needs to slow them down, if he needs to speed them up, if he needs to leak the relevant information. This can all be achieved much easier with someone like Ron Dermer leading negotiations than if it's Ronen Bar or David Barnea. There is obviously a lot of pressure, and there's a timetable that has to be adhered to. But again, these things are flexible. It's not clear if they've started yet. We've heard all different voices. Some who said phase 2 had absolutely started. We heard chairman of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, Yuli Edelstein, who really is in the know about a lot of things. He receives briefings that even some ministers don't, and he said phase 2 negotiations had begun, and then he had to walk it back, probably because he got a call from the Prime Minister's office. Others have said they're about to start. Others said that they won't start. Others that say they absolutely have no legality because the government hasn't the cabinet hasn't passed. So we'll have to wait and see. Probably we'll wait for the next few days. The release tomorrow of the bodies, and then the release of the 6 live hostages on Saturday. Just in the final 1 or 2 minutes, related to all this, obviously, is a very large buildup of Egyptian forces in the Sinai, well beyond what is allowed in the Israel-Egypt peace agreement in the late 1970s. It is something which is causing Israel some concern. To a certain extent, there isn't a belief that Egypt is going to attack Israel. What it probably most likely is a flexing of the muscles. It's a message to Donald Trump that the idea that you're going to push any Gazans into Egypt is not going to happen. Message also to Israel in there. They are guarding their border. They're making sure that there is no one is left in any doubt that anyone is going to be opening any gates from Gaza into Egypt. But it's still a concern. But at the end of the day, let's not forget that as much as Israel receives military aid or military assistance, Egypt, once it signed Camp David, once it signed the peace treaty, also receives an extremely generous annual sum from the US. And without it, the Egyptian army would be in a certain amount of trouble. And it's certainly not something that President Sisi could countenance. So it's probably some flexing of muscles, trying to send messages to Washington, to Jerusalem, but we'll have to see. Finally, we also saw the withdrawal from Lebanon, and it's with a bit of an asterisk that Israel is remaining in at least 5 points. I say at least 5 points because there's information that may be more, but officially it's remaining in 5 points along the border where it's removed its forces from everywhere else. It's an interesting way to end this. Without the sort of, I wouldn't say embarrassment, but the pictures and videos of Israeli soldiers once again withdrawing from Lebanon, while the war in other parts hasn't ended, wouldn't look so good for this particular government, this right-wing government. So they are remaining in 5 points also for security reasons. It remains to be seen how long the US has given its approval of that. Lebanon are complaining about it, but not too vociferously. What it also means, humiliatingly for Hezbollah, is while they have this massive grand funeral for their longtime leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in the next few days, Israeli forces will remain in Lebanon on Lebanese territory. And their big worry is that there'll be some sort of flyover by Israel, maybe breaking the sound barrier, making a lot of noise while this ceremony goes on. That is certainly for Hezbollah a major humiliation, but it's something that they're going to have to countenance for the near future. It remains to be seen what point Israel feel comfortable about removing from those 5 points on the border, but at the moment they're there and they're there to stay. So a lot to look out for in the coming days, weeks, and months. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Ashley. And what a devastating time and what a devastating revelation indeed. Now, as we near phase two of these negotiations, and as we all watched these male hostages being released in dire condition, President Trump in the last few days has once again reiterated and kind of doubled down on his all hell to pay threats against Hamas. Do you think this will have any bearing on what phase two of the negotiations will entail?
Well, as I said, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu feels that he has the complete backing of the US president, the administration. And if he walks away from the deal, if he has an excuse to walk away from the deal because of intransigence on Hamas's part, he'll feel that he has the backing. That is what not just President Trump, but some of the other officials have said, that they back Israel's stance on this, whether, Hamas can be removed diplomatically through negotiations. That's fine with them. It doesn't look like Hamas will do that, obviously. But if it takes military force, then they're quite prepared to back it. On the other hand, they do want these negotiations to happen. They do want phase two to happen. They do want all the hostages out, and they would like to see an end to the conflict. Now, it's very hard for all parties concerned how you get all these things at once. So something's going to have to give. But at the moment, it does seem that there is pressure from the US on Netanyahu to at least look like he's going through phase two. Again, if you ask the Prime Minister's office or people in the government, has phase two negotiations started, they'll say no. There clearly has been contact. There's been some early contact. There's been some, whether you want to call negotiations or not, there's certainly discussion. So it's clear that something towards phase two has already started, but it's not something that Netanyahu will come out officially and state because of all his domestic political considerations.
Thank you. Now, with the first phase of the hostage deal, and as we watch these hostages being returned from Gaza, Hamas has been putting on a big show with these ceremonial displays. You've seen the optics. They're smiling and waving. They're giving gift bags, etc., for their propaganda purposes. Now, tomorrow, the world is expecting a much different scene, as you mentioned, a much more somber scene, a darker scene. Is it still possible that Hamas will attempt to exploit this for their propaganda purposes? And do you think it's going to have any bearing on the public perception globally of Hamas?
Well, as you said, these smiling faces of these people have suffered for well over a year, with their goodie bags and all that. It's not for the average person around the world. Anyone who buys into that is just really, buying into the most ridiculous propaganda. But they do have supporters who do believe that, especially within the Arab world, that they were treated well. And they try and juxtapose the way that the Israeli hostages were treated with the way Palestinian prisoners were treated. So they do have an audience. Interestingly enough, there's been a lot of talk and even evidence to show that these scenes have been choreographed by Al Jazeera, that they've been very much involved, and Qataris have been very much involved and told them what sort of imagery they should be using and that they should be giving them nice things and all the rest of it. Absurdly, they put out a video, Tropanov, one of the recently released hostages, that he went fishing off the coast of Gaza before he was released. I mean, to the average sane, normative person, it's absurd. But there are people who buy it, especially within the Arab world, where everything is very carefully curated and they try and give off this image that they are a benevolent organization which treats its prisoners, as they call it. Obviously, we know that they're hostages who are kidnapped from their beds, from a music festival, etc., that they treat them well. Unfortunately, they, as I said, they do have an audience and they do have people who buy this up. Tomorrow is going to be a lot harder for them to sell. They will continue that noise that the Bibas family were killed by Israeli air attacks, despite evidence to the contrary, but they will have an audience that will believe them no matter what. I don't know how they would have some sort of ceremony that gives them any sort of credit, even amongst their base tomorrow, with basically coffins or shrouds or whatever, not to go into too many gruesome details. But we've seen more disturbing things from Hamas in the past. So you never know with them, and everybody hopes not, but you wouldn't put it past them. But I've got a feeling that some of the more media savvy people involved in this, maybe based in Doha, as I said, will probably advise them not to do anything like that. But it could be that they have videos that they show or prove in their mind that the Bibas family were killed by Israeli airstrikes. Let's not forget one of the Israeli female soldiers that were released, young female soldiers that were released, was asked to take part in this macabre faking her own death, where they covered her in a sheet with dust on her, showing that she had died. And we now know that that was just for show. So, I won't put anything past them tomorrow, and they'll keep to their line that they did not kill them. But the pathologists will probably be able to shed some light on that again, depending on what sort of situation the bodies are when they return.
Yeah, that is dreadful. But thank you very much. Now, Eric Selkov would like to ask. He begins, I read that Hamas said that the PA could temporarily take over Gaza. How do you think Israel would react to that offer?
Israel said pretty much from the beginning, it's been pretty consistent that it will not have the PA. This Israeli government considers the PA not that much different from Hamas. They haven't condemned October 7th. They continue paying the people who perpetrated October 7th. The only criticisms you'll find from the PA is for internal domestic purposes. They think it was a failure. They look at the destruction of Gaza and say you've achieved nothing, but it's just a tactical disagreement. This Israeli government does not see the PA as any better. Hamas have said that they would allow the PA to come in, but essentially they would be in charge. There's talk of a technocratic government. What that means is, in theory, people who are not overly associated with Hamas's military wing. I mean, if you hold any power, if you've ever held any power in Gaza, then you had to have a relationship with Hamas. So I don't know where you would choose a technocratic government from in Gaza, but they want the show. At the end of the day, regardless of whose names are in government positions or bureaucratic positions, Hamas would remain in charge. And when the focus was elsewhere, they would probably just take over completely. I mean, we've seen this before. We saw it after the disengagement, that within, I think it was 2 years, Hamas completely took over. It was supposed to be a shared government. It was supposed to be a unity government. And then we saw PA leaders thrown off very high buildings. So Israel knows that this is just a sham. And that's why they're absolutely against it. And it seems to be a no-go, at least from Israel's point of view. The Arab states are very much in favor of it. That's what they're talking about. But Netanyahu, anytime he's been asked about this, said absolutely not.
All right, thank you. Now, I think we have time for maybe one more here. Jay Lewis would like to ask, are Israelis generally satisfied as to how phase one worked out?
It's a difficult question. The polls that I've seen, the majority, quite a large majority, want this to continue. So when you say it's a very difficult question to answer. Are they satisfied? Most Israelis want phase two to continue. They do want the hostages out. Is it a good deal? No. No one thinks this is a good deal. No one's happy about some of the prices that Israel is having to pay. Probably tomorrow, as I said, out of everything that's happened since the negotiation started, this will be the one where there'll be no joy. There'll only be anger. Perhaps this will color some people's view. Again, timing is everything. Probably they're going to be released before Saturday, where we're going to have 6 live hostages released. And probably the thinking is that there'll be a lot of pain, anger, and sadness tomorrow, but that will then be tempered by joy and happiness on Saturday by seeing the 6 live Again, depending on the situation, but on the whole, people are still pleased to have them back, even when they are brought back in terrible situation. So that's probably a factor in it, and the fact that the BBASs are going to be released tomorrow, as opposed to the final one next week, because after that you don't have that live hostages to sort of temper the sadness with. So I think it's very much done in a very careful way. At the moment, Israelis do support continuing the deal, and I think that will probably remain that way for the foreseeable future. But we'll have to see. As I said, there's a lot of considerations to be taken into account if and when Phase B happens.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I believe we have come to the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us this week.
Thank you.
Of course, now for our viewers and listeners, we would like to take this time to invite you to our 2025 annual policy conference in Washington, D.C., which will be taking place on the week of May 19th of this year. For more information on panels, speakers, keynote presentations, please visit our website where you can also apply. It's just meforum.org/policyconference 2025, all one word. I will be sure to link it in this video description as well. We hope to see you all there, and we hope that you all have a wonderful weekend upcoming. Thanks.